Pyeongtaek, North Korea, John Doe, identified as Corporal Lawrence Robidoux. This is one of those stories where one realizes how much military families give up in a quest to keep the countries they come from free. And this goes for every country. These men or women don't cause or choose the wars, but they're still out there fighting on our behalf. Lawrence is one of those men. It's a story that starts 95 years ago. Lawrence was born on October 31st, 1928, in Saskatchewan, Canada. He eventually moved to the U.S., eventually joining the U.S. Army from Cumberland, Rhode Island. He would find himself assigned to B Company, 1st Battalion, 35th Infantry Regiment, 25th Infantry Division. In 1950, Lawrence was sent overseas, a memory that very clearly lives on in his young brother. It was the last time his brother Maurice ever saw Lawrence, and despite being only 4 years old, it's forever etched in his memory. He watched his brother get on the bus, and he watched continually as the bus drove away. It was the last time that Maurice, who is now 77, ever saw him. For that reason alone, it's something he says he can't forget. Lawrence was just 22 and in theory had his whole life ahead of him when he stepped on that bus. North Korea invaded South Korea in June of that same year, 1950. The troops in Japan were the first U.S. soldiers to ever enter combat. Doing this at some point in mid-July, the United Nations force fought to drive the invading country back across the border, pushing them north of the river, and this is the border of China, which you can see here. While some articles refer to him as Corporal, it appears he was actually promoted to U.S. Army Sergeant by the time that China entered the war, and then began launching major attacks. It was the Chinese that hit B Company on November 27, 1950. Young Lawrence hadn't even been at war a full 6 months by this time. B Company was defending Hill 234 at the time, which was 50 miles south of the Chinese border. 203 soldiers were there that day, and of those 203, only 26 men returned to safety. Sergeant Lawrence Robidoux and 77 others were reported missing and assumed to be captured. We know now that, along with many others, Lawrence found himself in a North Korean prison camp, and these camps were brutal. On June 27, 1953, 3 years after Lawrence boarded that bus and waved goodbye to his family, the United Nations Command and North Korean Communist forces signed an armistice that declared the ending of the war. Those who had been previously captured were interrogated on boats by sea for days before returning home. Soldiers who put their lives on the line in some cases were put into booths that were 4x4 to aid the interrogation of the prisoners of war. As cruel as this sounds, the reason was due to severe brainwashing in these camps. Some soldiers refused to leave, staying in North Korea. It was eventually determined that China and North Korean forces waged systematic abuse on the detainees, attempting to break down their beliefs in an attempt to convince the prisoners to collaborate against their home countries. Although 21 American soldiers refused to ever leave and come home, some of them posing here for the photo with a sign saying, "We stay for peace." The commonly accepted reason at the time for the brutal interrogations of those freed, they did eventually determine that 149 POWs held by the Chinese or North Koreans did suffer abuse meant to break down their entire beliefs. There were so many more men at the time, and most were not lucky enough to be freed ever. The camps, as I said, were brutal. Communist troops gathered prisoners and herded them into animal pens, treating them as if they were the animals that belonged in those pens. It was horrible. No shelter was provided at all, and the temperatures crashed below 30 degrees below zero, which is -1 Celsius. Some of these men had their outer clothing stolen by their captors, which takes cruelty to a whole nother level, leaving them in thin field jackets to try to survive in the brutal temperatures. And so many of these men were so young, late teens or early 20s, men that should have had a whole life ahead of them. Instead, they lived in those pens given very little food or water. Many got frostbite or starved. Sometimes they would earn food or privileges by saying positive things about communism. Those who survived by the end of the war were very lucky, but the pain they endured would last their whole lifetime. As for our John Doe, it was later confirmed that he was captured and passed in one of those camps. Yet for more than 60 years, it was never over for his family. They always assumed he perished, but they never gave up trying to find him. Sergeant Robidoux would find his place on a memorial, as you can see here. Yet his family couldn't let it go, because with every fiber of their being, they needed his remains returned home to them. And this finally happened after 70 years. In January, the Army announced that he had been found and was finally coming home. It's a bit of a miracle, but his 97-year-old sister is still alive to finally experience the closure. It was his big sister, Lucille, who was presented with several of Lawrence's awards, including the Prisoner of War Medal. Lucille's son, Lawrence's nephew, Larry, followed in his uncle's footsteps in joining the Army, serving 22 years himself, proudly representing the uncle he was named after. Larry was also working behind the scenes, trying as best he could to find the remains of his uncle. So many men died in that war also. The United Nations suffered a loss of over 11,000 men, and the Chinese lost 3 times that number. After the war ended, there was an operation named Operation Glory, and this was at the end of the Korean War on July 27, 1953. Operation Glory's purpose was not to leave men behind. By 1954, North Korea turned over 4,200 remains, of which 3,000 were determined to be Americans. In this case, Lawrence's remains were among them, but of course DNA was unknown for much of that time. So they were labeled and buried in Honolulu, Hawaii on February 16, 1956. Lawrence was one of 8 children in a French-Canadian family that had moved from Canada to Rhode Island here in the U.S. Amazingly, 6 of his siblings are still alive, with Lucille being the oldest at 97, and his brother Maurice, who waved goodbye on the bus all those years ago, is the youngest at 77. His family told reporters that they had always hoped he'd be identified during his mother's lifetime, but it wasn't meant to be. Despite this, they were thankful his family finally had the news and the closure they waited for all these years. He boarded that bus 73 years ago, going missing that same year. He was found in 1954 and went unidentified for 67 years. Had he lived, he would be 94 years old today. The St. Tammany Parish, Jane Doe, identified as Paula Boudreaux. There isn't a ton on this one. I'm hoping I'll be able to insert information later on. I'm sure my editor's notes sometimes annoy people, but just a heads up. I researched the story and photos initially and set them up. I record the audio, then edit that, and go back and sync it up with the pictures, and probably add more. That's why it ends up as a written note. My house is old and loud with a lot of people in it, so recording audio is a trick, so going back to add something is nearly impossible for me. So unfortunately, it's a note or nothing. In this case, we know that Paula was just 22 in 1986, and a relative had dropped her off at home. It seemed like a normal day, but it wasn't, because it was the last day that anyone admits to seeing Paula. We do know that her remains were found by hunters in a wooded area of St. Tammany Parish in Louisiana, and this was on March 13, 1989. This was 193 miles away from where she went missing, or, for those in other countries, around 310 kilometers. She was found about a year and a half after she disappeared. Paula left behind a 4-year-old son who is now an adult and has children of his own. Both her son and her son's father have been notified of the identification of her remains. But unfortunately, Paula's parents passed in the years that she went unidentified, never knowing that she'd finally been found. It does appear that they have an idea who took Paula's life, or at least they announced they have a person of interest. They haven't said who. Her COD is either not determined or not released yet. Paula went unidentified for 34 years. Had she lived, she would be 56 years old and a grandmother today. Huge thanks for watching all the way to the end, and a big thanks to all of you who consistently like and comment on the videos. The whole dance with YouTube is hard sometimes. Whether you leave a full comment or an emoji, it makes a huge difference. It's a huge push toward the videos being suggested to new people. The next goal is 20,000. Thanks everyone for watching. Take care of yourselves and each other.